You are listening to another No Fair Remembering Stuff, the Tuesday edition of the Professional Left podcast, and available wherever you get your podcasts, and at our website, proleftpod.com, where you can also contribute to this podcast. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution at The Professional Left Podcast, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791.
And it's not safe for work.
Today we're going to talk about American immigration policy. We're going to talk about what it used to be and what it is now and why it is what it is now and why it's broken and why Republicans have sabotaged nearly every proposal to fix it ever. So it's a simple subject. Shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to cover it. Boom, boom, we're in and out.
11 minutes tops.
Yeah. So
we'll have it fixed.
This is easy. Listen to this on the toilet, really. It's that quick.
Seriously, folks, let's begin at the very last moment in our history when there was a possibility that our broken immigration system might actually get fixed.
Mm-hmm.
From a 2014 NBC News article entitled, quote, "Why Immigration Reform Died in Congress," unquote. Subtitle, "Republicans saw no short-term benefit to working together on an immigration overhaul." The article briefly chronicles the history of failed immigration reform attempts since 2005-2006, when no matter who controlled which branch of government, there was always enough opposition from somewhere to prevent anything from happening. So, quoting from the article, "But now, no reasonable person can say that immigration's death in 2013 and 2014 is anyone's fault but House Republicans. Still, we also understand why they killed it. They saw no short-term benefit," unquote. And the theme of the show is that our immigration system and how broken it is a choice. And it's a choice by Republicans to keep it broken.
And this next bit comes from the past of that article that shows how staggeringly the media misunderstood what had been going on inside the Republican Party. If you read articles from this period, a lot of them end with, "But now all that's over and we can move on to something else," which is just mind-blowing when you read this stuff 9 or 10 years later. Quote, "Yes, the long-term politics for 2016 and 2020 cry out for Republicans to remove immigration as an issue. But doing so would be so painful. In the process, just see Eric Cantor's primary defeat. All of that said, the longer Republicans wait on passing immigration reform, the longer the wounds with Latino voters will take to heal." We'll simply quote from that RNC after-election autopsy report from March of 2013, quote, "We must embrace and champion comprehensive immigration reform. Our party's appeal will continue to shrink to its core constituencies only," unquote. This article was published on July 1st, 2014.
Almost exactly 1 year later, Donald Trump comes down the golden escalator and starts talking about how Mexicans are rapists.
Mm-hmm.
And he begins to show everyone what liberals have been saying all along, that the Republican Party is a deeply racist, deeply xenophobic party. And their members want walls and machine gun nests at the border. And that's it. That's what they want for immigration policy.
Period.
And today, Charlie Kirk and other internet loudmouth conservatives are actually arguing against legal immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Just shut it down, build a wall, and don't let anybody in.
Period. Because, there aren't enough women to go around for people like Charlie Kirk. If they get competition from swarthy, good-looking foreigners, then Charlie Kirk will never get laid.
Yeah,
it's totally unfair.
Back at this article, which talks about how Obama behaved decently and gave John Boehner much more grace than he deserved during this time when they were actually trying to get some immigration policy passed. The NBC 2014 article quotes Obama, quote, "I believe Speaker Boehner when he says he wants to pass an immigration bill. But last week he informed me that Republicans will continue to block a vote on immigration reform, at least for the remainder of this year, unquote. As a result, the Obama administration announced that it would take executive action on immigration policy wherever possible. And don't forget that Barack Obama deported more people over the southern border than any president before him.
Yeah. He was the deporter in chief.
Yeah.
He was, and it was incredibly cruel and incredibly drastic. And
he did it to enforce existing policy,
right,
so that they would change existing policy.
That's right. And he made no friends among his constituents by doing so. But it didn't matter because Republicans hated him because he was a black Democrat. And they were going to go on hating him no matter what he did. And this was Speaker of the House John Boehner's response. Remember, John Boehner was the Speaker of the House. Quote, "In our conversation last week, I told the president what I've been telling him for months. The American people and their elected officials don't trust him to enforce the law as written. Until that changes, it's going to be difficult to make progress on this issue," unquote. Don't trust the black Democrat from Chicago to enforce the nation's laws. Now, for those of you who may have forgotten, all of this was straight out of the same playbook Republicans had been successfully running since the day Obama was sworn in. President Obama proposes something reasonable to address a crisis. Then this is usually something that Republicans themselves are on the record as having supported. Then Republicans block it. Then Obama issues an executive order as a stopgap method to address at least part of the problem. Then Republicans attack him as a tyrant and take him to court over his executive actions, all while the media demands to know, why won't Obama lead? Rinse and repeat for 8 bloody years.
Now, resentment of immigrants is nothing new. It probably goes back to when humans were tribes on the African savanna fighting over water and hunting grounds. Suspicion of immigrants in the United States is actually older than the United States. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin was all freaked out in Philadelphia about German immigrants. He wrote to Peter Collinson in 1753, which is before 1776, by the way. Quote, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us, instead of our anglicizing them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion," unquote. Germans were not white enough for Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah. And it was not then common sentiment. Around the same time as Franklin's letter, a minister named Henry Muhlenberg, who was the father of the American Lutheran Church, who had himself only recently arrived from Germany, was very worried that, quote, "the whole country is being flooded with ordinary, extraordinary, and unprecedented wickedness and crimes. Oh, what a fearful thing it is to have so many thousands of unruly and brazen sinners come into this free air and unfenced country," unquote. Yeah, just a big empty continent being filled up with weirdos. Now, you might have heard of a guy named John Jay. I hope you have. I'm going to quote from Wikipedia about his CV. He was an American statesman. He was a patriot. He was a diplomat, abolitionist, one of the signatories of the Treaty of Paris, and a founding father of the United States. He served as the second governor of New York and the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He directed U.S. foreign policy for much of the 1780s and was an important leader of the Federalist Party after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788, which is, you must admit, a very impressive resume. A lot of law schools named after John Jay in this country.
Yes, yes.
Also on his resume, but not mentioned nearly as often, is that Jay was a member of the Church of England and later of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America after the American Revolution, and as a member of the New York Provincial Congress, which was one of the local revolutionary provisional governments formed by colonists in 1775, he tried unsuccessfully to enact a prohibition against Catholics holding office. And while considering New York's own constitution, he lobbied, quote, "for a wall of brass around the country for the exclusion of Catholics, unquote.
Fast forward to Teddy Roosevelt, who was panicked about the diminishing population of old stock Anglo-Protestants in America. Southern and Eastern Europeans not only were arriving at U.S. shores in large numbers, their families were large and ever growing here in the U.S. Their family size and the birth rate among Italians and Eastern Europeans was huge. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had 6 children, and he even used the term race suicide as applied to the white elites who were not having enough babies. White Anglo women were, in Teddy Roosevelt's opinion, committing race suicide by limiting their family size.
Teddy was doing his part,
He was doing his part.
Yeah.
In June of 1901, then Vice President Teddy Roosevelt wrote to a friend, "All the other problems before us in this country, important though they may be, are as nothing compared with the problem of the diminishing birth rate and all that it implies." You will note from all the above commentary that there was anxiety about America becoming not only a non-white nation, but a papist nation.
And we pause.
No Irish need apply, Driftglass.
Yes. We'll get into that in some depth. Or we'll just let Pete Seeger sing a little song about no Irish need apply. Or just go watch Blazing Saddles. That's all you really need to understand U.S. immigration policy. Go watch Blazing Saddles. Now, it's important to remember that the doors of the United States were once wide open to immigrants. Indeed, until 1924, the immigration policy of the United States was no policy at all, unless you were Asian. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was the first time a specific group of people were restricted from emigrating to the U.S. by country of origin. But white people, and who was considered white was a topic of huge debate, white people arrived in the U.S. under open borders until 1924. Please remember this when your MAGA relatives say that their ancestors arrived here legally. If they arrived here before 1924, they walked in or sailed in under an open border policy.
And here's more for your MAGA family members. White people who arrived here in the 19th and early 20th century from non-English speaking countries did not learn English, as evidenced by large numbers of foreign language newspapers in the United States. Now, they may have learned English, but when it came to the language they spoke at home and the language that they read in the newspaper, it was the old country's language.
Well, and the language in their neighborhoods, the language of commerce.
Exactly, and their neighborhood in New York City, exactly, right. Now, I'm going to pick on Italians in this podcast, and you'll see why by the end of the show. It is estimated that more than 4 million Italians migrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920. 4 million. As immigrant communities grew larger and larger, the immigrant press also boomed. There were 98 Italian newspapers published uninterruptedly during this period in the U.S. 98 Italian language newspapers.
Yeah.
And their circulation was quite large. In 1900, almost 700,000 Italian language newspapers were sold in the United States. And allow me to insert this very interesting side note about immigration and misogyny. And Driftglass had never heard of this. And this was news to me also.
I had never heard of this. And, I'm a reasonably well-read person. I had never heard of this.
Yeah, this is pretty amazing.
Yep.
The Expatriation Act of 1907 declared that women assumed the citizenship of their husbands. And this act stripped citizenship from U.S.-born women when they married non-citizen immigrant men. This act was repealed in 1920 after women gained suffrage, and women who had lost their citizenship due to the Expatriation Act automatically regained it with the Cable Act of 1922. But there were 15 years in the United States history when a woman marrying a non-citizen man meant that woman lost her U.S. citizenship.
It reminds me, honestly, of the repeal of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
Which is one day you wake up and your rights are gone.
Yep.
and they just took them away.
And if you were a man marrying a non-citizen woman, you were fine.
Because the penis does the picking, honey.
The penis does the picking.
The penis is in charge.
So
but if
you're not a threat. Your citizenship is going to produce good babies.
If you're a woman
marries a foreigner, then her babies are tainted.
Are bad. Well, and a woman is the property of the man she marries.
Exactly. That is presumed by this law, that she is his property, and therefore, if he is not a citizen of the United States, neither is she.
And that the government of the United States has every right to stick their nose in and declare who's a citizen, who's not, who's got rights and who doesn't, depending on the whim of whoever's in charge.
And whether they like who you married or not.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Roe versus Wade thing of having your rights, one day you woke up and your rights are gone, and some number of years later, hopefully you get them back, is not a new thing, especially when it comes to women.
Let's hope it doesn't take 15 years.
No. Let's hope it takes one election cycle.
Yep.
In the 1920s is when things got even uglier in this country. Fears of increased immigration after the end of World War I and the spread of radicalism, pardon my lack of pronunciation there, propelled Congress to enact an emergency measure imposing drastic quantitative caps on immigration in 1921's Emergency Quota Law. And in 1924, the doors of the United States closed. The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 established extended national origins quotas, a highly restrictive and quantitatively discriminatory system. The quota system would remain the primary means of determining immigrants' admissibility to the United States until 1965. The Johnson-Reed Act did two things that were downright bigoted. It set quotas for immigration by country, and the quotas favored those countries dominated by Protestants. Yeah, my people win again. Yes. For instance, the annual quota for immigrants from Italy. Remember how many Italians came to this country?
Yeah.
Just a few decades ago? 4 million. The annual quota from immigrants from Italy was now 5,802.
Per year.
Per year, which is a very specific number. Now, the annual quota from Great Britain, however, was 65,721 a year.
Every year. Another 65,000 British people could come to the U.S., but only 5,000 Italians.
Isn't that strange? The other bigoted thing about the Johnson-Reed Act was it left up to U.S. consulates in home countries to filter out, the undesirables.
Yep.
If you wanted to emigrate to the U.S., you needed a visa from the U.S. consulate in your country. And forget it if you were a Jew or a gypsy or any other kind of undesirable.
Which became a huge thing in 1939.
Oh, yeah.
Because the German consulate the U.S. consulate in Germany was not going to let any Jews leave.
No, this was one of the great shames of this country. We did a lot of terrible things during World War II. The internment camps for Japanese American citizens, but the idea that we turned our back on Jews when we knew they were being imprisoned and exterminated.
When we knew they were being slaughtered.
We knew it. We knew it. And we wouldn't let the boat land here. We wouldn't let one of the immigration boats land. We turned them away, knowing what would happen to them because of our immigration policy.
Because of the prejudice that inspired our immigration policy. It's always political.
Absolutely.
And it's always based on the prejudices of those in power.
Mm-hmm.
So let's fast forward again to the middle of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Immigration is always political, as I've said. And the U.S. government had no problem running ad campaigns to convince Americans that letting in Chinese, Hungarian, and Cuban immigrants to escape communism was a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Ditto South Vietnamese refugees after we abandoned Vietnam, and Iranian immigrants when the U.S.-backed dictatorship there collapsed. And don't forget that in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed a sweeping immigration reform bill into law. Now, it was sold as a crackdown. There would be tighter security at the Mexican border, and employers would face strict penalties for hiring undocumented workers. But this really was a handout to Reagan's friends in the agricultural industry. Mm-hmm. The bill made any immigrant who'd entered the country before 1982, that was only 4 years earlier, eligible for amnesty. But guess what? Those strict penalties for hiring undocumented workers, that was stripped from the bill before it reached Reagan's desk.
Mm-hmm.
Who gets punished for benefiting from illegal immigration is, again, pure politics.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1965, going back a little bit, in 1965, Congress passed a different standard for immigration, which was not based on country of origin and quotas by country. Each country, instead, would receive the same annual cap of 20,000 people. And for the first time, countries in the American hemisphere faced numeric caps. So Mexico and South America and Canada also had the same cap. This immigration law imposes a system of preferences for family reunification, 75%, employment, 20%, and refugees, 5%. This law opened the door to non-European immigration in unprecedented numbers, with many arriving through the employment preferences, which heavily favor highly educated workers. So that's why you see a lot of foreign-born doctors these days.
Yeah.
Is because they come to this country highly educated, or they are educated and they get more education here.
This is the H-1B
and our immigration policy appreciates that.
This is the H-1B program. This is bring and you know what? There was a brain drain. It was called brain drain in Britain.
Yes,
during the 50s and 60s, when it was high tax policy in Britain was causing many of their most talented people to
like the Beatles
to seek citizenship in the United States for the low tax rates.
Because all of a sudden they had money.
Yeah.
And they didn't like paying so much in taxes. Yeah. So this immigration policy contributed to the image of Asian Americans who have immigrated predominantly since 1965 as model minorities, which is another version of racism, let's face it. However, because the law does not provide for immigration by unskilled workers, quote unquote, in sectors like agriculture, construction, and elder care, it has fostered a growing population of unauthorized immigrants who are gainfully employed and needed in our economy, but lack lawful means to immigrate.
Yeah, they're needed. The agricultural industry would collapse without them. The elder care industry would collapse without them. They pay their taxes. They raise their families. There
isn't a roof in America.
Yeah.
There certainly isn't a roof in Springfield, Illinois.
Yeah.
That isn't built by Mexican-American labor.
After our derecho here,
you
could go down the street, you could go down our street and see these extremely skilled men working up on roofs, blasting music in a different language, and doing an excellent job. And I hope getting paid a good wage for it. And going home to their families and supporting their families and putting their kids through school and doing everything you want an American citizen to do. Getting up early, working hard, and supporting their family. And the whole system would collapse if those people are not allowed to work here. Now, the majority of unauthorized immigrants are from poorer countries in the Americas seeking greater opportunity in the wealthier United States. You have a border between one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the world butting up against one of the poorest areas in the history of the world. So, of course, you're going to have immigration between the two, which could be of mutual benefit to both countries if Republicans weren't such racist assholes. U.S. white supremacy wants the fruits and particularly the low price tag of immigrant labor, but not their presence either in citizenship or in policy. And this is when we have to again call bullshit on the racist rhetoric coming from the right. We are not being invaded in any way compared to the, say, industrial age influx of immigrants into this country. The percentage of people in the United States of foreign birth, again, as a percentage of the overall population of the U.S., is lower than it was in 1880. That said, there are a lot of immigrants in the United States. And you know what? There have always been a lot of immigrants in the United States. We can either accept all of us, except Native Americans, came from somewhere else, or we can let our fear of the other dictate our policies and our behavior. It is true that due to economic and political upheavals south of the border, immigration to the United States, both legal and illegal, is exploding. But when Fox News and Republican congressmen wail about over 2 million illegal border crossings, just like they wail about the tons of fentanyl They never mentioned that these numbers are the numbers of people and pounds of drugs apprehended at the border by U.S. officials. Is there a crisis with way too many people crossing into the U.S. with no papers and no means of supporting themselves? Yes. Can we fix that with legislation? Absolutely, but not with the xenophobic Republican Party controlling the Congress.
And don't forget that the number of people arriving from war-torn South and Central America are a far cry from the 20 million immigrants, of which, again, 4 million alone were Italians, who arrived and stayed in the U.S. permanently between 1880 and 1920.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add to that the period right before the pandemic, people were starting to notice that more Mexicans were crossing the border back into Mexico than were coming to the United States. And that was starting to be a concern to the agricultural industry again. Like, are we going to be able to have enough workers? Because people were finding opportunities for work in Mexico.
Well, this is my wheelhouse. This is one of my wheelhouse. Not immigration, workforce development.
Yeah.
And the number of business people I talked to just in Springfield, businesses in Springfield that have shut down or are talking about shutting down or reduce their hours because they can't find enough skilled workers to do the job they want them to do.
Yeah.
Even if they pay them $20 an hour or more, they can't find the
hire
people to do it.
anybody. Yeah.
There was and is a massive demographic bulge coming through our population where a whole bunch of people, the boomers and the people trailing right along behind them like me, are retiring.
Yep.
And there aren't enough people who are skilled and ready to take their place to keep the place running. And we all know that. So you have two choices. Massively increase through cloning, I guess, the number of people of employable age and imbue them with knowledge of how to run factories overnight, which is never going to happen. Or you start letting people into the country who can do the jobs those retirees
either they are trained or they are trainable.
Yes.
Right.
And there are lots of people, wonderful people, good, hardworking people all over the world who want to do those jobs, who would love to be Americans, who'd love to come over here and do that. And
not to mention, Driftglass, you talk about a demographic bubble.
Oh, yeah.
The demographic bubble in the next 10 or 20 years who are going to desperately need someone to feed them, wipe their butts, keep their bedding clean because they're in their 90s and they can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And that is considered unskilled labor, but it is actually highly skilled labor.
It's highly skilled labor. The number of people who are retiring from the transportation, distribution, and logistics sector, the railroad workers who are retiring. There's just no planning for what to do once they're gone. And there was a shift in the economy, the Great Recession and pandemic, all of which have sort of juggled those numbers around a little bit, but it doesn't matter because eventually those people retire or they die.
Yeah.
And there's simply not enough skilled bodies to do the work that those people leave behind. Yeah. And we could really use the help because if you'd like someone to pay your Social Security and for your Medicare and Medicaid, you better have a large working population cranking out good wages.
And paying into Social Security and Medicare.
Taxes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the idea that we can't do that because Republicans are lunatics and old and
like
racist.
Brown people and don't want to press one for English.
Is insane. And the fact that and this is the thing that drives me most insane, Blue Gal. This is not a meteor headed for the Earth. This is a man-made problem. This is a problem that we can actually fix. We
can see it coming.
Yeah, but we can fix it. It's not unsolvable. Everyone knows what the fix is. Everyone knows what the sweet spot in compromise between reasonable conservative, what used to be conservative concerns about the U.S. border and security, and reasonable concerns about the future of the U.S. economy and the need for many, many more immigrants in this country and the need for training programs for them. All of that is solvable. More immigration judges, a reform of the refugee policy, get the dreamers off the books and into U.S. citizenship. All of that's so doable.
And pass the Build Back Better Act so that care workers and the care economy has a pay structure that is a living wage.
However, standing atop this giant pile of fixable problems shouting no are the Republicans. Yeah. And one of them is more prominent than all the rest on Fox News. Isn't she, Blue Gal?
Yes, because I've been picking on Italians. You also ought to mention that a certain so-called Democratic senator from West Virginia also
Yes.
stands on top of that pile, stopping things. But
He
anyway.
doesn't have a job on Fox News yet.
No, he doesn't yet. No, I've been picking on Italians in this podcast because the point person for shouting about illegals as if human beings are illegal on Fox News is one Maria Bartiromo. She is the granddaughter of Italian immigrants who is a board member of the National Italian American Foundation.
Italian Americans know who they are and are proud of it. My dad's family is from Naples. My mom's family is from Agrigento, Sicily. They were very young. My grandfather, Carmine, came to this country first when he was 11. You could imagine how hard it must have been to leave a place where you had so much safety and you had your friends and your family. But they had that hopefulness and optimism that if you came to America, you could start anew and create a better life for your family. And frankly, that's exactly what they did.
Guess who the National Italian American Foundation invited to speak at their 2023 gala mere months ago? Joe Biden and Jill Biden came to say how wonderful it is that Italian Americans have contributed to the United States, have contributed to culture, have contributed to the economy. Now, Maria is very big on bragging about her immigrant grandfather who arrived in the U.S. in 1911 and went back and forth from Italy to Brooklyn multiple times to bring his family over. His last trip was in 1934. He was a bricklayer who built his own restaurant and bar with a brick pizza oven that he built.
Yeah.
The Bartiromos served in the U.S. military, and they are a Gold Star family from World War II. They have a lot to brag about.
Mm-hmm.
And Maria brags about it all the time. But she doesn't mention that her grandfather got here at a time of open borders for Italians.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't mention ever whether she speaks Italian or whether the language spoken at her grandparents' dinner table. Was it English? Was it Italian? Was it a mix of the two? Because I would bet my own farm it isn't solely English.
Mm-hmm.
Her own silence on that issue, as well as all of the Italian newspapers of New York City circa 1910 to 1940, proves the lie on that. Her family got here and prospered, and good for them. They worked hard. She brags all the time about everyone in the family, and you always yell child labor when I talk about this.
Yeah.
Everyone in her family worked in the restaurant.
Yeah.
And Maria Bartiromo was a coat check girl. She, in her office, has the sign from when she was a coat check girl that says 50 cents, please pay in advance. Why was she the coat check girl in that restaurant? Why was she front of the house? Because she could speak English.
Exactly.
And so her family got here and prospered because of open borders.
Mm-hmm.
And because English only was not the law of the land.
Exactly.
She's a huge hypocrite. And her hate speech against people who don't have the benefit that she has of having arrived at a certain time in American history is atrocious. And one of the things that we've been talking about throughout the process of developing this show today, Driftglass, is citizenship and how valuable it is.
I did want to mention that in the neighborhoods where I lived in Chicago, especially on the north side, that the typical habit was a family buys like the corner liquor store, where I got my beer and my scotch from for several years when I lived on Winthrop and Kenmore. It was owned by a family. The whole family lived there. Then they bought the business out next door, and the one after that, another family might buy a restaurant, and one after that. There's a whole strip of Philippine-owned businesses that are all the same way. It's at the roads that go out as axles, as spokes in Chicago, are all immigrant roads. They're all ones where you start off here, and as your family prospers, you move further and further towards the suburbs. The guy who worked for me, wonderful young man, not quite so young anymore, and I'm still in touch with him, who had an apartment near where I worked for the city. And I visited him there many times. And as I understand it, it turns out that that apartment, that rehab loft apartment, was the former refrigerator factory where his grandfather worked when they moved here as immigrants. It's a constant, wonderful immigrant story. But yeah, one of the things we talked about in prepping for this podcast, and we just talked about generally, is the concept of citizenship. And we're not going to preach, but this involves a Bible story. Except it's actually a matter of history. The character of Paul in the Bible. We're not going to talk about the historicity of Jesus, but the character of Paul in the Bible was a real person.
He's a real person. I mean, really documented that he existed. Yes. And
he might or might not have, gotten in a shipwreck, and might or might not have walked a distance, and might or might not have saved the people on the ship. All that is irrelevant. But what was true is that he was a follower of Christ, and he was in trouble because of it. And he was going to be imprisoned and tortured and whatever. But he was a citizen of Rome. And as a citizen of Rome, he had the right to appeal his case all the way up to the emperor.
Yep.
And so he got to go from the little town where he lived in Jerusalem, in that area. He got the right, as a former tax collector, I believe, to...
And a persecutor of Christians.
A persecutor of Christians. He earned the right to take his case to court, to be treated well by guards, to not be flogged by them, because if you flog a Roman citizen, you're fucked.
You got to answer for that. Yes, yes.
And there's a whole suite of privileges that went along with being a Roman citizen, which is why Rome guarded its citizenship so carefully, why it was awarded only to certain people. Same thing in this country.
Yeah.
In this country, our proud democracy started off with citizens being only white male landowners.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Because everyone else was beneath them. And then gradually we had to let other people vote. And then we had to let African Americans vote. Then we had to let women vote. It's always a process of the people who have power.
And really we actually let women vote before we let African Americans vote.
Yes, we did.
And the amount of racism in the women's suffrage movement is the subject for an entire different podcast.
We should do something called No Fair Remembering Stuff, perhaps, on that subject as well.
Racist white ladies.
Yeah. Racist white ladies have done...
Well, and that's the other thing that we should bring up, which is this whole... insanity and wailing on Fox also about critical race theory.
Yeah, come on.
And critical race theory actually is a graduate school subject where they talk about who decides who is white and who isn't.
That's right.
It is immigration studies. It is not necessarily about Black people, although it is.
It is.
But it is about the construct of race and how immigrant communities gained acceptance. The Irish became police officers, and then they became judges. And all of a sudden, they have political power in cities along the East Coast, and they are accepted. So the Irish, coming here, were treated like shit.
Right, how the Irish became white.
That is the first book in the oeuvre of critical race theory. Yeah. The first major book is How the Irish Became White. This Maria Bartiromo thing, in researching this, I had no idea that Italians were lynched by the Klan because Catholicism was the devil.
The papists were the devil.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't want papists here any more than we want Black people here.
Well, if you want to go dig through some of the Jack Chick tracts.
Yeah, Chick tracts.
The 60s and 70s, you will see that Catholics are lumped in with every other group like sodomites, and people believe in evolution.
Right.
Burning in hell.
Right.
It is such a recent development that Catholics weren't considered the devil, and the Pope was considered the prince of hell. And it is all a matter of who has the power to define the narrative? Who has the power to say who's in and who's out, who's up and who's not?
And this is one reason that there's a lot of nervous energy in the Republican Party right now about aid to Ukraine.
That's right.
Because there is a critical mass of Ukrainian Americans in Ohio where there is a Senate race that Republicans would like to win.
Yeah. Yep.
And if Republicans look like they're shitting on Ukraine, they're not going to get that vote. People do vote their ethnicity.
They do. They do.
And if they're just Ukrainians who consider themselves white and are going to be white and vote Republican because they're white, that's a reliable segment for Republicans. But if all of a sudden Ukrainians wake up and say, hey, wait a minute, you're persecuting my homeland, it becomes a different issue.
No, there are reasons why we have Pulaski Day off in Illinois, in Chicago. Because outside of Warsaw, there was no larger Polish population than Chicago.
And it's a statewide holiday.
Yeah.
Because Chicago has all these Polish people living
That's
in
right.
It. Yeah.
Exactly right. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a wonderful thing. But it is a matter, and you can see, especially in Chicago politics, and we've done podcasts on this, that when the question of who gets privilege and who gets power comes to the fore, when it's not Richie Daley, Irish son of immigrants, Irish man, Irish going to Irish Catholic, et cetera, when it's a black guy, suddenly ethnicity, like a switch being flipped, Eddie Verdoliak becomes the arch enemy of the mayor of the city of Chicago.
Right. And a Republican.
Virtually a Republican.
You're virtually a Republican.
And eventually an actual Republican, strictly over race, over the line of race, over who gets to be a first-class citizen and who has to be a second-class citizen or any citizen at all. And it's always been that way, and it's always going to be that way.
And that's another subject that we really didn't have time to go into, but forced immigration.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Of black people into this country and forced rape of those people to produce babies is a completely huge topic for what happened in the South.
Yeah, when it came to open borders, our open borders were plenty open for importing slaves.
Until they weren't.
Until they weren't. Exactly right.
As soon as it became clear that adding more slaves to the economy hurt slave owners, and that the commodity of simply raping your female slaves and producing a wealth source from selling those children, that's when you started seeing a shutdown of the slave trade across the Atlantic. The other thing, speaking of immigration, is to remember how many white people came over to the United States as indentured servants in the colonial period especially. And they paid for their potato famine refugees themselves, right? They don't have a pot to piss in, but they need boat fare to get across the country. And they paid for it by signing up for a number of years, usually 6, to work for somebody.
Indentured servitude.
As an indentured servant. And you see in colonial newspapers ads for escaped servants who, just like escaped slaves, run away from the brutality of being owned by somebody. And even though it's a temporary contract and so forth, and for whites it's very different, they're still escape, track them down, hunt them down. Here's his picture. Find him and track him down because I own him. And we have completely forgotten that history.
Oh, for a while in this country, again, taking skin color out of it just for a second, the life of an Irish laborer was worth much less than the life of an African or American slave.
Because you could sell a black person.
Yeah.
Right.
Because,
and so,
so
the Irish unloaded the dynamite ships.
Right.
Because if it exploded, who cares?
Who cares? There'll always
but that's
be more
my
Irish.
property. Those black people are my property, and that would cost me something if something happened to them. Yeah.
And you're right. It always comes down, and I would only modify this based on what you previously said. It comes down to politics and economics.
And economics. And who benefits. And it's the same with agricultural owners under Reagan.
Absolutely.
We need to strip out those penalties because, I might need to hire some illegals if I can't, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's absolutely, life is a shit sandwich.
Yeah. Well, and this is not the only part I find at all reassuring about this. I mean, the Romans used to, When you conquer a country or a province and let's say a town is full of people who are happy to be loyal to Rome, great. You give them Roman citizenship or limited Roman citizenship. That's fine. That's great. If they're not loyal, if they didn't surrender immediately, you take their land from them.
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
you either move them to Rome and use them as laborers and slaves, but you just take their land and give it to your citizens. Give it to the people you want.
Yeah.
This whole idea of taking whole populations, just moving them around based on economic advantage, loyalty to the crown or to the empire, who's nearest the water source, what do you need? Do you need a port? Do you need farmland? All of that is ancient. That's been going on forever. As long as human beings have been fighting over anything, any territory, any water and whatnot, it's been going on. What we're going through now is not new. What is new is that there is an identifiable group who are standing in the way of progress.
Yep.
You don't need to know a whole lot beyond the fact that if you want immigration reform in this country, you have got to get rid of the Republican Party in power. There's just no way around it.
Like all other kinds of progress.
Yeah. There's always a group. There's always standing in the way. And until they're moved aside, nothing much is going to get better soon. In this case, the thing that makes it a little bit different here is we actually have that party controlling a large media corporation, that tells their own people that it isn't their fault.
Right.
That what they are seeing and experiencing in their life is actually the fault of those devil liberals and their desire for open borders. And they want to flood the country with fentanyl for some reason. And that Joe Biden is pulling the strings of all this. And you can't debate that with them. You can't argue that, but you can vote them the hell out of office. And I think on that note, we want to remind people, don't forget, we really need more Patreons to make this podcast fly. So if you can spare $5, please spare $5 and visit our Patreon at patreon.com/proleftpod. And thank you for doing that. See you next time.
Arrivederci alla prossima.
See you next time. The Professional F podcast No Fair Remembering Stuff Tuesday edition is produced under a Creative Commons license. Copyright 2022-23, DGBG Productions.